The crisp manila folder trembled in Maria's hands as she rushed through the crowded Manila streets, her heart hammering against her ribs with each hurried step. 10 years of sleepless nights, countless double shifts, and every sacrifice her family had endured. All of it converged on this single morning, this one final interview at St. Catherine's Medical Center. The prestigious hospital represented everything she'd fought for: stability, respect, a chance to lift her parents from their cramped apartment where her father's medication bottles lined the windowsill like soldiers of debt. She checked her watch again, calculating the minutes with desperate precision, knowing she had exactly 12 minutes to cross 3 more blocks. But fate, as Maria would soon discover, had written a different script for this day. The universe had placed an impossible choice directly in her path, disguised as a teenage girl bleeding on the sidewalk. And in that heartbeat of decision, everything Maria had built would crumble or transform forever. The girl lay crumpled against the concrete wall, her designer jacket torn at the shoulder, crimson spreading across her white sleeve like watercolor on wet paper. Pedestrians flowed around her like water around a stone, their eyes sliding away with practiced urban indifference, their footsteps never slowing. Maria froze mid-stride, her interview folder suddenly feeling impossibly heavy, her future pulling her forward while her training, her very soul, anchored her to this spot. She looked at her watch, then at the girl's pale face, then at the gleaming hospital tower visible in the distance. "Please," Maria whispered to no one, to everyone, to God himself. "Not now, not today." But the girl's eyes fluttered open, dark and disoriented, and Maria felt her legs moving before her mind had finished its desperate calculations. "I'm a nurse," Maria heard herself say, her knees hitting the pavement, her hands already assessing the wound with professional efficiency that overpowered her screaming thoughts. The girl's eyes locked onto hers, surprisingly alert for someone injured, watching Maria's face with an intensity that seemed to pierce through skin and bone. Maria pressed her scarf against the bleeding shoulder, her phone balanced against her ear as she called for an ambulance, her other hand checking the girl's pulse with fingers that had tended to hundreds of patients. "Stay with me," Maria commanded softly, though she wasn't sure if she was speaking to the girl or to the dream of her future slipping away with each passing second. The girl's lips parted as if to speak, but she remained silent, her dark eyes never leaving Maria's face. In the distance, the hospital clock tower began to chime, each bell note striking Maria's heart like a judge's gavel, sealing her fate with cold finality. The ambulance arrived as Maria's interview time came and went, the opportunity she'd chased for a decade evaporating like morning mist under harsh sunlight. She rode with the girl to a small community clinic, her phone buzzing relentlessly with the hospital's calls that she couldn't bring herself to answer, each vibration another nail in the coffin of her carefully constructed plans. The girl never spoke during the entire journey, never asked Maria's name or thanked her, just watched with those penetrating eyes that seemed to see everything Maria was sacrificing in real time. When the clinic doctor finally took over, Maria stood in the harsh fluorescent hallway, her blood-stained hands shaking, her folder of credentials clutched against her chest like a shield that had failed to protect her. She had chosen compassion over ambition, humanity over opportunity, and as she stumbled out into the afternoon heat, Maria couldn't decide whether she'd just committed the greatest act of courage or the most devastating mistake of her entire life. The clinic's walls were painted a tired shade of cream that had yellowed with time, the antiseptic smell mixing with the humid air that drifted through the half-open windows. Maria sat beside the examination bed where the girl lay, her wound now cleaned and bandaged with professional precision, though Maria's hands had moved through the motions like a ghost performing a remembered dance. The doctor had stepped out to handle another emergency, leaving them alone in a silence that felt thick enough to touch. Maria's phone lay face down on the metal tray beside her, its screen dark now, all calls. finally ceased. The hospital had clearly moved on to other candidates, other futures, other dreams. She should leave, Maria told herself, should go home and face the wreckage of this day. But something kept her rooted to that plastic chair, watching the mysterious girl who had cost her everything. The afternoon light slanted through the windows, casting golden bars across the floor like a prison of her own making. "You should call someone," Maria finally said, her voice rough with exhaustion and unspoken grief. "Your parents must be worried about you." The girl's eyes opened slowly, fixing on Maria with that same unsettling intensity that had marked their entire encounter, as if she were memorizing every line of Maria's face, cataloguing every emotion that flickered across it. She didn't reach for a phone or ask to borrow Maria's, didn't offer her name or request help contacting anyone, just continued that silent observation that made Maria feel simultaneously seen and studied. "Can you at least tell me your name?" Maria pressed, leaning forward with a desperation that surprised her, needing something, anything, to make sense of why this girl had become the pivot point of her entire existence. The girl's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, more like a recognition of something Maria couldn't yet understand, but still she remained silent. Maria felt tears prick her eyes, the weight of the morning finally crashing over her like a wave she'd been holding back through sheer will, and she turned away, not wanting this stranger to witness her breaking. "I had an interview today," Maria whispered to the peeling paint on the wall, her voice cracking. "The most important interview of my life, and I chose you. Instead." The girl shifted on the bed, and Maria heard the rustle of fabric, the small intake of breath that preceded speech. But when Maria turned back, hope flaring in her chest, the girl had closed her eyes again, retreating into silence. It was like being haunted by a living ghost, Maria thought, this presence that had upended her world, but refused to become real, to speak, to explain why Maria's sacrifice had been necessary. She watched the girl's chest rise and fall with steady breaths, noted the expensive quality of her torn clothing, the manicured nails that spoke of wealth and privilege, and felt a bitter laugh catch in her throat. "You probably don't understand what I gave up," Maria said softly, not expecting an answer anymore, speaking only because the silence demanded to be filled with her grief. "You probably have everything handed to you, have never had to fight for anything, never had to choose between your heart and your survival." But even as the words left her lips, Maria saw the girl's hand clench slightly, a micro-expression of pain that had nothing to do with the physical wound on her shoulder. In that small gesture, Maria glimpsed something she hadn't expected, that perhaps this mysterious girl carried her own invisible injuries, her own complicated story, written in the language of silence. When the doctor returned and cleared the girl for discharge, Maria finally stood to leave, her body aching as if she'd worked a 48-hour shift instead of spending a few hours in a clinic chair. The girl's eyes tracked her movement, and for a moment, Maria thought she might finally speak, might offer some explanation or gratitude that would make sense of this catastrophic day. "Take care of yourself," Maria said quietly, gathering her blood-stained folder, her ruined dreams pressed between pages of credentials that no longer mattered, and she walked toward the door without looking back. She didn't see the girl sit up, didn't notice the way those dark eyes followed her with something that looked like determination mixed with respect, didn't hear the soft exhale that might have been the beginning of words finally formed. Maria stepped out into the golden afternoon light, the heat hitting her face like a slap, and began the long walk home to tell her family that she had failed them, that compassion had been more expensive than any of them could afford. Behind her in the clinic, the mysterious girl finally spoke her first words to the empty room, so quiet they were almost prayer. "Thank you for seeing me as human, not as useful." The apartment building rose before her like a monument to broken promises, its concrete facade stained with rust and rain, the windows reflecting the dying light of a day that had stolen Everything from her. Maria climbed the 3 flights of stairs with leaden feet, each step echoing in the stairwell like a countdown to judgment, her hand gripping the railing so tightly her knuckles went white. She could hear the sounds of other lives bleeding through thin walls. A baby crying, a television blaring game show laughter, the couple. On the 2nd floor, arguing about money again. And she felt herself disappearing into that chorus of struggle, just another voice in the symphony of barely surviving. Her mother would be waiting, Maria knew, probably at the kitchen table with the bills spread out like tarot cards predicting their future, her father in his worn armchair, pretending to read the newspaper while his worried eyes tracked every sound. Maria stopped outside her door, her key trembling in her hand, and she almost turned around, almost ran back down those stairs to anywhere else. But where could you run when you carried your failure inside you like a second heartbeat? She pressed her forehead against the cool metal. Door, breathing deeply, tasting salt from tears she hadn't realized were falling, and pushed inside. The apartment greeted her with its familiar smell of rice and regret. The small space made smaller by the weight of unmet expectations that seemed to press down from the water-stained ceiling. Her mother looked up from the kitchen table where she sat with bills arranged in neat, devastating piles, her face flickering from hope to confusion to dawning horror as she registered Maria's disheveled appearance, the blood stains on her clothes, the folder clutched against her chest like armor that had failed to protect her. "Maria," her mother breathed, standing so quickly the chair scraped against linoleum. "What happened? Why are you here? The interview was supposed to last until—" The words died as understanding bloomed across her mother's face like a flower opening to poison rather than sunlight. Maria's father emerged from the bedroom, his medication bottles rattling in his shirt pocket, his illness making him frailer each month. But his disappointment still possessed enough strength to fill the room. "I didn't get the job," Maria whispered, though the words felt inadequate, too small to contain the magnitude of what she'd lost, and she watched her mother sink back into the chair as if the news had physical weight. "There was a girl. She was hurt, bleeding. I had to stop. I had to help her," Maria continued, the explanation tumbling out like a confession to crimes she wasn't sure she regretted committing. Her mother's hand moved to cover her mouth, her eyes glistening with tears that made Maria feel like she was drowning while standing perfectly still. "We needed this," her father said quietly, his voice thin as the paper bills scattered across the table, each one a reminder of how they'd borrowed against a future Maria was supposed to secure. The words hung in the air between them, not an accusation exactly, but something worse. A simple statement of fact that made Maria's choice feel simultaneously noble and catastrophically selfish. Her mother reached for the topmost envelope, the hospital bill from her father's last emergency room visit, the amount printed in numbers that looked like a prison sentence, and Maria watched her trace the figures with trembling fingers as if trying to make them mean something different through sheer force of will. "I know," Maria replied, her voice breaking on those 2 syllables, and she moved to sit beside her mother, placing her ruined folder on the table among the bills like evidence in a trial she'd already lost. "Mama!" She was just lying there, no one else was stopping, and I thought— But what had she thought really in that split-second decision that had rewritten all their futures? That compassion mattered more than survival, that her nursing oath meant something even before she officially wore the uniform, that some choices demanded to be made even when you couldn't afford their cost. Her mother took her hand, squeezing it with a grip that communicated both love and loss, understanding and unbearable disappointment, and Maria felt something inside her crack open like an egg, revealing not new life, but only emptiness. The evening descended on them like a weight, the apartment growing dark around their small circle of kitchen light, none of them moving to turn on additional lamps, as if the shadows might hide what they all now understood, that Maria's compassion had purchased a stranger's welfare with her family's security. Maria sat at that table long after her parents retreated to their room, staring at the hospital bill, the overdue rent notice, the electricity warning, each document a testament to how little margin for heroism poverty actually allowed. She thought of the mysterious girl's face, those observing eyes that had witnessed Maria's sacrifice without offering name or gratitude, and felt a complex knot of emotions twist in her chest. She didn't regret helping, couldn't regret choosing human life over personal advancement, but the cost was a living thing now, breathing in this small apartment, consuming the air they all needed to survive. Was it worth it? Maria whispered to the empty kitchen, to herself, to whatever God might be listening to the prayers of foolish nurses who stopped for bleeding strangers, and the silence that answered felt like both judgment and test. She gathered the bills into a neat stack, turned off the light and sat in darkness wondering if integrity was something only the wealthy could truly afford. 3 days passed like a slow hemorrhage of hope, Maria moving through her shifts at the community clinic where she still worked part-time, the place that paid barely enough to justify the commute, but kept her hands busy and her nursing skills from atrophying into uselessness. She was restocking supplies in the cramped medication room when her supervisor appeared in the doorway, her expression caught between confusion and curiosity, and told Maria someone was waiting for her outside, a young girl who refused to leave until she spoke with Nurse Santos. Maria's heart performed a strange percussion against her ribs as she walked toward the clinic entrance, and there, standing beneath the flickering fluorescent light of the waiting area, like an apparition conjured from guilt and memory, stood the mysterious girl from the street, perfectly healed now, holding a cream-colored envelope between both hands as if it contained something fragile. Their eyes met across the scuffed linoleum floor, and Maria felt time fold in on itself, collapsing the distance between her choice and its consequences, between the help she'd given and whatever reckoning this moment represented. The girl moved forward with careful steps, extending the envelope toward Maria with a solemnity that seemed too ancient for someone so young, her expression unreadable but purposeful in a way that made Maria's stomach tighten with apprehension. "This is for you," the girl said softly, her voice carrying an accent that spoke of private schools and privilege, nothing like the wounded silence she'd maintained during their first encounter. Maria stared at the envelope, her hands remaining firmly at her sides, her professional smile frozen into something that felt more like a grimace as understanding crashed through her like a cold wave. This was charity. This was pity dressed in expensive paper. This was the girl's wealthy family trying to purchase absolution for the career Maria had sacrificed. "I can't accept that," Maria replied, her voice tight with a pride she couldn't quite afford but refused to surrender, the words emerging sharper than she intended, cutting through the clinic's antiseptic air. The girl's eyes widened slightly, surprise flickering across features that had remained so carefully neutral when Maria had cleaned her wounds, and she lowered the envelope but didn't withdraw it completely, holding it in the space between them like a bridge Maria was refusing to cross. "You don't understand," the girl began, but Maria was already shaking her head, exhaustion and stress and 3 nights of staring at unpayable bills converging into something hard and unmovable in her chest. "I helped you because you needed help, not because I wanted payment, not because I expected anything," Maria said, each word measured and deliberate, her nursing training insisting on calm, even as her emotions churned like stormwater beneath her professional surface. The girl's expression shifted again, something like frustration mixing with what might have been respect, and she took another step closer, closing the distance Maria had tried to maintain, the envelope still extended between them, like evidence in an argument they were both trying to win. "If you would just listen," the girl pressed, her voice gaining an edge of desperation that didn't match her composed appearance. But Maria was already turning away. her pride and her poverty warring inside her with equal ferocity. She had sacrificed her future to help a stranger, yes, but she would not compound that choice by accepting money that felt like it was purchasing her principles along with her silence. "Please leave," Maria said quietly, the words costing her something essential even as she spoke. Them, because part of her, the part that remembered her mother's tears and her father's medication bottles and the stack of bills growing taller each day, was screaming at her to take the envelope, to swallow her pride, to let this mysterious girl's money solve the problems her compassion had created. But she walked back toward the medication room. Without looking back, her shoulders straight, despite feeling like they carried the weight of every wrong decision she'd ever made. And she didn't see the girl's expression transform from surprise to something deeper, something thoughtful and calculating that suggested this rejection was not the ending Maria had intended it to be. The envelope remained in the girl's hands, unopened, unaccepted, a transaction refused, while behind the clinic's closing door, Maria pressed her palms against the cool metal supply cabinet and tried to convince herself that integrity was worth the price of perpetual struggling. Maria made it through the next 2 hours on autopilot, her hands performing their familiar routines, while her mind replayed the encounter in endless loops. And when her shift finally ended, she stepped outside into the evening heat, expecting nothing but the long bus ride home to her regrets. Instead, the girl was still there, seated on the low concrete wall that bordered the clinic's parking area, the envelope resting beside her like a patient companion, her posture suggesting she'd been prepared to wait indefinitely for this confrontation to reach its true conclusion. Their eyes met again, and this time Maria saw something different in the girl's expression, something sharp and evaluating that hadn't been visible through the vulnerability of injury and blood, a intelligence that had been carefully hidden beneath silence and observation. "I wasn't bleeding when you found me," the girl said simply, the words dropping into the humid air between them like stones into still water, and Maria felt the ground shift slightly beneath her understanding of everything that had happened. The girl stood slowly, deliberate in her movements, and picked up the envelope with hands that no longer trembled with injury but with purpose. Her entire demeanor transformed from victim to something far more complex and unsettling. The wound was real enough to be convincing, shallow enough to be safe, and I stayed silent because I needed to watch you without the contamination of conversation or gratitude, she continued, each word precisely delivered, as if she'd rehearsed this confession but was discovering its emotional weight only in the speaking. Maria's breath caught somewhere between her lungs and her throat, realization spreading through her consciousness like ice water, understanding that she hadn't stumbled upon someone in need, but had instead been observed, evaluated, tested, like a specimen under laboratory conditions. "I've watched 7 nurses pass me on that same street corner over the past 3 months, the girl said, moving closer now, her youth suddenly less evident beneath the calculating awareness in her eyes. 5 ignored me completely. 1 called for help, then left before it arrived, and 1 demanded payment before touching me. So when you knelt down and just started helping, when you sacrificed your interview without hesitation or resentment, I knew I'd finally found what I was looking for." The envelope extended again between them, but this time it carried different weight, no longer charity, but something stranger and more complicated, evidence of manipulation wrapped in cream-colored paper that somehow made Maria's sacrifice feel simultaneously more meaningful and less authentic than she'd believed. "My name is Catherine Chen," the girl said, and the surname detonated in Maria's awareness like delayed recognition, because everyone in this city knew that name, knew the family that owned half the private hospitals and medical facilities, including the prestigious institution where Maria had destroyed her chances 3 days ago. "My mother is Elizabeth Chen, CEO of Metropolitan Medical Group, and I've been searching for someone genuine. Someone who helps people because it's right, rather than because it's profitable, because she needs staff she can trust after being betrayed by people who only valued her money and position. Maria stood frozen in the parking lot's fading light, her exhaustion transformed into something electric and disorienting, while Catherine held the envelope, steady between them, no longer offering charity, but extending proof of a test Maria had passed without knowing she was being examined. The world tilted slightly on its axis, reconfiguring everything Maria thought she understood about choice and consequence, about the random compassion she'd offered and the deliberate observation she'd unknowingly endured, about whether her integrity had been authentic when performed for an audience of one calculating witness. Inside this envelope is documentation of what happened, my statement about your character, and my mother's private contact information, Catherine said quietly, and for the first time since revealing her deception, something almost apologetic flickered across her features, as if she recognized the violation inherent in testing someone's humanity without their consent or knowledge. Maria's hands finally moved, not to accept the envelope, but to press against her temples, trying to contain the confusion and anger and strange wounded pride cascading through her thoughts, because she'd believed her sacrifice was pure, untainted by observation or judgment, a private transaction between her conscience and the universe. But Catherine stood waiting with the patience of someone accustomed to getting what she wanted eventually. The envelope still extended, still offering whatever complicated redemption or opportunity it contained, while around them the clinic parking lot emptied of cars, and the evening deepened into something that felt suspended between revelation and reckoning, between the nurse who'd helped without knowing she was being watched, and the girl who'd orchestrated the entire encounter with surgical precision. Maria finally took the envelope, not with acceptance, but with the trembling fury of someone needing tangible evidence that this violation had actually occurred, and she tore it open with movements sharp enough to damage the expensive paper, while Catherine watched with eyes that flickered between guilt and defensive justification. The documents inside confirmed everything with corporate precision, medical reports, surveillance photographs of Maria kneeling beside Catherine on that street corner, detailed observations of her behavior written in clinical language that reduced her compassion to data points, and measurable qualities that could be analyzed and valued. You staged an injury to evaluate my character like I was applying for some secret position, Maria said, her voice low and dangerous in a way it had never been before. Years of nursing discipline cracking under the weight of manipulation disguised as opportunity. Catherine absorbed the anger without flinching, her youth suddenly more visible again, a teenager playing adult games without fully comprehending their emotional consequences or the trust she'd violated in the name of finding authenticity through manufactured crisis. I was running away when you found me, Catherine said quietly, shifting the narrative in a direction Maria hadn't anticipated, vulnerability seeping back into her confession like water through foundation cracks. My family controls everything in my life, my schedule, my friends, my future, and I was trying to disappear into the city when I realized I could also search for someone real, someone my mother desperately needs but can't find through normal hiring channels because everyone performs for interviews, then reveals their true nature later. The words carried weight beyond manipulation now, hinting at deeper wounds and complicated family dynamics where a teenage girl felt compelled to test strangers' humanity because her own world contained so little of it she could trust. Maria's anger didn't dissolve, but complicated itself, mixing with unwanted empathy for this calculating child who'd turned her own rebellion into a recruitment operation, who'd weaponized her loneliness and her mother's betrayal into tests that violated the very authenticity she claimed to be seeking. My mother built Metropolitan Medical from nothing after fleeing her own country with only her nursing degree and determination, Catherine continued, moving closer. Despite Maria's obvious fury, drawn by the same quality she'd observed 3 days ago, the inability to completely harden against someone else's genuine pain, regardless of how justified the anger might be. Then, people she trusted, people she'd mentored and promoted, stole from her, leaked confidential patient information for money, betrayed every value she'd tried to build her company around. So now she trusts no one, and works alone, and is slowly destroying herself because she can't delegate to anyone whose integrity hasn't been tested beyond normal human breaking points. The explanation didn't excuse the deception, but contextualized it, revealing Catherine's manipulation as inherited trauma, a daughter trying to solve her mother's crisis with the blunt tools of adolescent logic and too much unsupervised freedom. Maria stood in the darkening parking lot, holding evidence of her own commodification, understanding finally that Catherine's test wasn't really about finding a good nurse, but about a girl trying to heal her mother's capacity for trust by delivering proof that genuine people still existed in a world that had taught them both to doubt authenticity itself. "You had no right to test me," Maria said finally. But the envelope remained in her hands, rather than being thrown back at Catherine's feet, because somewhere beneath the violation was a strange recognition of two people damaged by systems they couldn't control, both searching for something real in a landscape of performance and transaction. Catherine's confession emerged not in one complete narrative, but in fragments that revealed themselves as the light faded completely from the parking lot, leaving them standing in the amber glow of a distant street lamp that transformed the moment into something suspended outside normal time. "My mother's betrayal happened 7 years ago," Catherine said, her voice carrying the weight of a story she'd clearly told herself countless times, worn smooth by repetition, yet still capable of cutting. Her head of operations, a woman she'd mentored for 15 years, someone who attended family dinners and knew our private struggles, sold patient records to pharmaceutical companies and insurance investigators who used the information to deny coverage and target vulnerable people with predatory offers. The specific cruelty of the betrayal hung between them, explaining the elaborate testing, the inability to trust normal interview processes, the desperation that would drive a mother and daughter to such ethically questionable methods of evaluation. Maria felt her anger shift again, not diminishing but deepening into something more complex than simple outrage, because she understood institutional betrayal, had witnessed how a single corrupt nurse could destroy patient trust across an entire ward. After that, 3 more people my mother trusted were caught in various schemes, Catherine continued, and now her teenage composure was cracking, revealing the child underneath who'd grown up watching her mother's faith in humanity systematically demolished. A billing manager who created false patient accounts, a supply coordinator who diverted medications to black market distributors, a senior physician who accepted bribes to recommend unnecessary procedures that benefited equipment suppliers while harming patients. Each revelation built on the previous one, painting a portrait of systematic corruption that had taught Catherine's mother that competence and credentials meant nothing compared to character, that traditional hiring practices couldn't identify the moral infrastructure that determined whether someone would protect or exploit the vulnerable. Maria thought of her own modest background, how she'd never had enough power or access to betray anyone on such scales, how her integrity had never been tested by opportunities for significant corruption because she'd never been granted significant trust. Catherine was describing a world where success created exposure, where building something valuable meant becoming a target for those who'd rather steal than create. My mother stopped sleeping normally, started conducting surprise audits at 3 in the morning, implemented surveillance systems that make employees feel like criminals before they've done anything wrong, Catherine said, and Maria could hear genuine anguish now, a daughter watching her mother transform into someone unrecognizable. She alienated good people with her suspicion, created a workplace culture of fear rather than healing. And she knows it's destroying what she built, but she can't stop because every time she tries to trust someone, her mind replays those betrayals like evidence that faith itself is a professional liability. The confession revealed the true purpose of Catherine's test, not just finding an employee, but providing her mother with irrefutable proof that trustworthy people existed, evidence strong enough to penetrate years of defensive cynicism. So I started watching people when she wasn't looking, creating situations that revealed character when no one knew they were being evaluated, searching for someone whose integrity was reflexive rather than performed. Catherine finished, her eyes meeting Maria's directly despite the obvious shame. I needed to bring her someone whose goodness couldn't be questioned, whose compassion functioned without audience or reward, because maybe then she could remember why she became a nurse in the first place instead of just a woman protecting herself from the next inevitable betrayal that statistics and experience tell her is always coming. The explanation didn't erase the manipulation, but reframed it as a rescue operation, a daughter trying to save her mother from drowning in justified but ultimately destructive distrust. The silence that followed Catherine's confession stretched. Between them, like a bridge, Maria hadn't decided whether to cross until she felt something harden inside her chest, a resistance that surprised even herself, given how much the girl's story had moved her moments before. "I won't do it," Maria said quietly, the words emerging with a finality that made Catherine's eyes widen in the amber streetlight. Confusion spreading across features that had clearly expected gratitude rather than refusal. "I won't let you fix this for me. Won't let your mother give me a position because I passed some secret test rather than because I'm the best candidate, because that's just another form of the corruption you're trying to escape, just dressed in prettier clothes that smell like redemption instead of theft." The explanation tumbled out faster as Maria's certainty grew, fueled by every scholarship she'd earned through merit rather than connection, every clinical rotation where she'd proven herself through skill rather than favor, a lifetime of building credibility that couldn't be purchased or gifted without destroying its entire foundation. Catherine stepped backward as though physically pushed, her hand still extended with the envelope that now seemed to contain something toxic rather than salvation, her carefully constructed composure shattering completely. "You don't understand what you're refusing, what this could mean for your family, for your career, for everything you've worked toward," she said. And Maria could hear genuine bewilderment beneath the words, the incomprehension of someone who'd never had to consider that integrity might be worth more than opportunity. "My mother doesn't offer positions like this to anyone, doesn't create opportunities from nothing, and you're going to throw it away because of some principle about earning what you already proved you deserve." The question hung in the cooling air between them, carrying the weight of different worldviews colliding, the unbridgeable distance between those who'd always had access and those who'd spent lifetimes justifying their presence in spaces that questioned their belonging. Maria felt tears threatening, but refused to let them fall, maintaining eye contact despite the crushing weight of what she was rejecting, the practical voice in her head screaming that her family's bills didn't care about philosophical purity. "I've spent my entire career fighting the assumption that I'm only in rooms because someone felt sorry for me, because diversity requirements needed filling, because I knew the right people, rather than because I'm good enough to be there on my own terms," she said, each word costing something precious, burning her throat with their difficulty. "If I take this position now, knowing how it came to me, I'll spend every day wondering if colleagues respect my skills or just my connection to your family, if patients trust my competence or just tolerate me because administration protects me, and that doubt will destroy me faster than unemployment ever could." The confession revealed the deeper injury beneath surface pragmatism, the accumulated weight of 1,000 small moments where her abilities had been questioned, her achievements attributed to everything except her actual capability. Catherine's hand slowly lowered, the envelope hanging forgotten at her side as something shifted in her expression, respect replacing the bewilderment in a transformation Maria watched happen in real time beneath the street lamp's amber glow. "You're the first person who's ever refused something my family offered," Catherine said softly, and now her voice carried wonder rather than confusion, as though Maria had just revealed a superpower whose existence she'd never imagined possible. "Everyone else finds ways to rationalize acceptance, to convince themselves they deserve whatever advantage presents itself, but you're willing to sacrifice everything to preserve something they can't see or measure or put on a resume. And that's exactly what I was trying to prove existed, even though I didn't fully understand it until right now, watching you walk away from your own rescue." The Blacktown car arrived so silently that Maria almost didn't notice it gliding to a stop in front of her building, its presence transforming the modest street into something from a different reality, until the rear door opened and a woman emerged whose bearing commanded attention without demanding it, authority worn like a second skin that required no announcement. Catherine's posture changed instantly, a visible tension threading through her shoulders as she whispered a single word that carried the weight of 1,000 complicated histories compressed into 2 syllables. And Maria understood before introductions were necessary that she was meeting the architect of both Catherine's privilege and her pain. The CEO whose empire had rejected Maria's application just days earlier. "Mrs. Chen," Maria managed, her voice steadier than her racing heart, maintaining the dignity that had cost her everything to preserve, even as she wondered whether this arrival meant vindication or some new form of judgment she hadn't anticipated facing tonight. Victoria Chen moved toward them with measured steps that suggested she'd learned long ago how to cross distances without appearing hurried, her expression unreadable in the amber streetlight until she stopped directly before Maria, studying her with an intensity that felt like being catalogued and assessed and somehow understood simultaneously. "I've been searching for my daughter for 3 days, mobilizing security teams and private investigators and every resource at my disposal, slowly losing my mind with scenarios of what might have happened to her," Victoria said, and Maria heard genuine emotion fracturing the professional composure, raw fear bleeding through carefully maintained control. "And then tonight, I receive a call telling me she's been found safe, standing outside a nurse's apartment, talking to the same woman who helped her when she was injured and alone, never once attempting to leverage that connection for personal advantage, despite having every reason and opportunity to do so." The words landed like individual weights, each one carrying acknowledgement that felt more valuable than any position or salary, recognition from someone who understood exactly what Maria had sacrificed, because she dealt in transactions and knew the true cost of what had been refused. Catherine moved closer to her mother with hesitant steps that revealed years of complicated navigation, reaching for Victoria's hand in a gesture that seemed both familiar and freshly uncertain, testing whether reconciliation might be possible after whatever rupture had sent her running toward the streets where Maria had found her bleeding. "She helped me without knowing who I was, stayed with me when she had somewhere important to be, chose my welfare over her own future before she had any reason to believe it might matter to anyone," Catherine said, and Maria realized she was being defended rather than explained, advocated for by someone who'd tested her and found her worthy according to measures that transcended professional qualifications. Victoria's expression shifted as she listened to her daughter, something softening around her eyes that suggested she was hearing more than just words about a stranger's kindness. Perhaps recognizing in Maria's choices the same principles she'd been trying to instill in Catherine before their relationship had fractured beneath the weight of control and rebellion and misunderstood intentions. I built my career believing that competence and character could be measured through interviews and credentials, through references and performance metrics that reduce human complexity to data points that fit on evaluation forms. Victoria said finally, her attention returning fully to Maria with an intensity that felt like being seen, rather than simply observed, acknowledged as a complete person, rather than a collection of qualifications. But you've demonstrated something my systems can't measure, an integrity that costs you opportunities rather than creates them, and my daughter is standing here safe because you possess exactly the kind of character I've spent years trying to identify in people who've learned to perform authenticity rather than live it. The words hung in the cooling night air, carrying the weight of an offer Maria sensed forming before it was spoken. Opportunity arriving dressed in different clothes than she'd expected, extended by hands that understood refusal as evidence of worthiness, rather than insult to be punished. Victoria reached into her handbag with deliberate grace, withdrawing not the employment letter Maria had expected, but something that looked more substantial. An embossed folder that caught the streetlight as it changed hands, feeling heavier than mere paper when Maria accepted it with trembling fingers that betrayed the composure she'd fought to maintain throughout this surreal encounter. Inside, you'll find an offer for the nursing position you interviewed for, because your qualifications were never in question, and my hiring committee's concerns about your tardiness seem remarkably insignificant when measured against why you were late. Victoria explained, and Maria's heart lurched with relief and vindication before the CEO continued speaking, her tone shifting into something more purposeful. But beneath that letter is a second proposal, one I'm creating specifically for you, to develop and direct a new department focused on compassion-based training, teaching our staff that technical excellence means nothing without the humanity you demonstrated when you chose my daughter's well-being over your own ambitions. The words reshaped Maria's future in real time, transforming her from rejected applicant into architect of institutional change, offering not just employment but purpose that aligned with the values that had cost her everything just days earlier. Catherine stepped between them, with an expression that blended hope and uncertainty, looking at Maria with eyes that held the beginning of something that transcended gratitude, a connection forged through authentic encounter rather than social obligation or manufactured networking. I know I tested you unfairly, treated our meeting like an experiment when you were offering real kindness, but what I learned about myself by watching you changed something I didn't know needed changing, Catherine said, her voice carrying the tentative quality of someone learning to speak truth after years of performing expected roles. I'd like to help with this new program, if you'll have me, to learn what you know about seeing people as humans rather than functions. Maybe become someone who makes choices like yours, instead of running away from families who love me, but forgot how to show it properly. Maria saw Victoria's expression fracture slightly at those words, maternal pain and recognition crossing her features as she understood how deeply her daughter had needed exactly what this stranger had provided, without agenda or expectation. The folder felt like possibility made tangible as Maria opened it carefully, scanning words that offered salary figures exceeding what she'd hoped for in the original position, start dates that gave her time to transition properly, responsibilities that would let her transform institutional culture from the inside rather than simply serve within it. I need time to process this, to make sure I'm accepting for the right reasons, and not just because I'm desperate or grateful or overwhelmed by everything that's happened tonight, Maria said, and even as she spoke she saw Victoria nod with approval, recognizing that someone who could refuse immediate acceptance possessed exactly the thoughtful integrity this position required. Catherine reached out to squeeze Maria's hand with warmth that promised friendship beyond this crisis, a connection that might outlast jobs and programs and the specific circumstances that had brought them together on a street corner where despair had transformed into unexpected hope. Maria walked back toward her apartment, carrying the folder against her chest, like a treasure that might evaporate if not held carefully. Turning at her doorway to see Catherine and Victoria still standing together in the amber light, mother and daughter talking with a closeness that hadn't been visible before, and she understood that perhaps she'd helped heal more than just physical wounds that day on the street. Inside her modest living room, she placed the folder on the table her family would gather around tomorrow morning, imagining their faces when impossible news became tangible. Reality, when sacrifice revealed itself as investment rather than loss, proof that choosing compassion over convenience sometimes rewards the choice-maker in ways that transcend the immediate transaction. The city hummed beyond her window with its usual indifferent rhythm, millions of strangers moving through their private struggles and victories. But tonight, Maria felt connected to something larger than individual survival, part of a story about character and consequence that gave meaning to the hardest choices she'd ever made. Would you have stopped to help if it meant losing everything you'd worked for? Subscribe to see more stories about the choices that define who we really are.